I'm here with Laura Del Rosa.
Hi, I'm Laura Del Rosso. I created this exhibit at the Pacifica Coastside Museum. The exhibit is about the early artichoke farming period, which in today's Pacifica, back then it was known as Pedro Valley and Salada Beach. And I used a lot of the information from Julia Gervais's book to do the exhibit. I originally knew Francine Brevetti years ago, met Francine, and I remembered that she had mentioned in a book that she wrote that she had relatives in early Pacifica, and they were artichoke farmers. I contacted her and I found out that Julia Gervais had a whole memoir, and it turned out the Pacifica Museum in its archives has one of the copies of Julia's memoir. So I used some of the pictures for the exhibit. We've got pictures of Julia and her big extended family here, the Micheluccis. And we have a picture of Julia on the artichoke farm in 1930 with her cousin, who I think was one of the Rovais that still had an artichoke farm in Pedro Valley, which is Lindemar today. But it's been a great experience. It's been a lot of fun because a lot of it has to do with my own family history. My family had an artichoke farm, and I think it was very close to the Rovais farm in Pedro Valley. And I believe my dad and my uncle were friends of theirs. I remember hearing stories about the Rovai family. It's been a really great experience, and I want to thank Julian for connecting us and also for making a donation to the Pacifica Coastside Museum.
Well, the whole family made it.
The entire family,
Yes.
the Micheluccis, the Lunchis, and the Lattis. Thank you very much for your contribution. Really appreciate it.
And we want to thank you too for all the displays that we had at the reunion as well. It's very special.
I'm glad you were able to use the displays. That's fantastic. Thank you. Spaniard to come to California was Portola, and when he came up, he actually camped in what is today Lindemar, and where the Sanchez Adobe is. And so this year is the 250th anniversary. He did not discover, he was the first European to see San Francisco Bay.
Oh.
That's the discovery site on the hill between San Bruno and Pacifica, right up near, how do I describe it? Around Skyline College, if you go up ahead, it's GGNRA, it's like part of the parkland. So this year is the 250th anniversary of that, which is going to be, so they're going to have a commemoration of the event. They're going to reenact the hike that Portola did. So it'll be fun.
I always thought it's cool how Baja California is.
I know, isn't it? Yeah, he came up, and when he got to what is today Lindemar, there was a Ohlone tribe that had their village there, and they were really nice to them because the Spaniards they were kind of running out of food, and the Ohlones gave them some food.
Yeah.
So it's called Sweeney Ridge. You probably heard.
Oh yeah, it's a nice hiking spot.
Yeah, it was really great hiking because you can go up there. So then they hiked from Lindemar that morning, and they went up to the top, and and when they got to the top, they saw this bay. They weren't really sure what it was because they were a little lost. They thought maybe it was Monterey. And they saw all these fires around. So there were villages of Ohlones all around San Francisco Bay that they saw. We don't say that he discovered it really, because obviously people were living here for centuries.
Yeah.
He was the first European to see it. So, and then there is this Sanchez Adobe, and they're building a new interpretive center there, and there will be a lot more explanation of what went on here. So this is a little bit about the Ohlone village later became a outpost of Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And unfortunately, the Indians there were not treated well, and they became, servants, and some would say even slaves of the mission. And what is today Lindemar had really good soil, and so they grew a lot of food for San Francisco there at the mission outpost. And so the Ohlones were used as farm workers, and they were baptized there. And they lived there for a long time. The other thing that's really interesting about the coast, I don't know, tell me your name again.
Ryan.
Ryan,
Yes.
there was a railroad
Oh.
The Ocean Shore Railroad went from San Francisco, and it was supposed to go all the way to Santa Cruz, but they only made it as far as Tunitas, and then from Santa Cruz they had a few stations, and then in between they just used like a kind of like a jitney bus service. But it was a beautiful and very difficult thing to build all along the coast, like Muscle Rock, and it came down, and two of the train stations are still up, and you can see them.
Oh, okay.
One is on Pedro Point, and one is a restaurant in Valimar called the Valimar Station. Valimar Station, and this is the one at Pedro Point, which I think some surfers live in right now.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
And it was called Tobin Station for a long time, after the name of the family that owned most of Pedro Valley.
Keep the name on this one.
It's kind of a fun restaurant. If you go in that restaurant, they have a lot of historic photos in there of the Ocean Shore Railroad. So this is the, unfortunately this is gone. This is the station that would be right here.
Yeah.
Because the train went right in front of this building and went up and down the coast. And the artichoke farmers used the train to transport their artichokes to, it's kind of near where the Giant Stadium is.
Yeah.
It went all the way there, and then from there, I'm not exactly sure, then they shipped them to the East Coast. I don't know if I guess the train went this way and then went to the East Coast. So that helped the artichoke industry really boom too, because you know, all of a sudden then from Half Moon Bay, from Pacifica, then the artichokes were shipped all the way to the East Coast. And then they had to learn how to market the artichokes. A lot of Americans who were not Italian or French or Spanish did not know how to eat artichokes. You know, they're a little tricky to prepare. So they would have, there was an artichoke growers association in Half Moon Bay, I think like around 1915. And they started putting brochures in the artichoke crates, like how to prepare the artichoke. Here's how to eat an artichoke.
Oh, that's cool.
But we think that most of the people who bought the artichokes in New York or Chicago were probably immigrants from Italy or you know,
Well, they
but
shipped them all the way to New York and Chicago?
It was a huge thing. They had refrigerated cars, and the artichokes went as fast as they could to the East Coast. And before the San Mateo County coast artichoke farmers got so big, artichokes on the East Coast came from France. They were shipped from France to New York. But once this started going,
Where do they go from? Once they go to this train, where do they go? Where do they go to? Oh, they busted all the way down.
So the leisure people, because they promoted this train as a weekend adventure, right? So people from San Francisco would come for the day or the weekend. It was called the Ocean Shore Railroad Reaches the Beaches, and they started selling lots. But you know, it's not exactly the best weather for a beach vacation down here. But people did come. Here's the picture. It was not profitable. The train did not make any money. And then when the cars started coming, the train died because people started buying cars and doing it by cars. But it must have been a beautiful trip. This is what it looked like around Devil's Slide, the train. They had to build a lot of trestles and everything down around Lobitos Creek, which I think is kind of near where the Giant Stadium is. And then the 06 earthquake came just as they were finishing it, and there were all these slides around Muscle Rock. Apparently some of the tunnels are still there if you go down to Muscle Rock.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They wrote a book on the train too, right?
There is a book on the train. It's one of those, I don't know what they're called, but you can find it on Amazon. It's Ocean Shore Railroad. We might have one in the gift shop too. The train history is really interesting. So this is about this neighborhood here called Sharp Park. And there's a golf course. The history of the golf course is a little complicated because it is part of San Francisco. It's owned by the city of San Francisco. And the reason that is complicated, but we have a whole description here. Across...
is it considered San Francisco?
Well, no, but it's owned by the city of San Francisco. It's part of the Parks and Rec Department of San Francisco. And it has to do with the family called Sharp donated the land to the city of San Francisco. And they continue to run it. Across from the golf course, or kind of even next to it, in World War II, kind of a sad story.
Oh man.
Maybe you've heard about Tanforan Shopping
Oh,
Center in San Bruno.
the-
Well, a lot of people don't know, but there was an internment camp in what is today Pacifica, and mostly
Was it
Japanese, but there were Italians.
Oh really?
Yeah, including one artichoke farmer in Pedro Valley. We don't know how, sometimes they just detain them for a day or two, but if you were not, the Italians who were not American citizens they were enemy aliens. My father was one of them. He was not an American citizen during the war, and so but he was not detained. He was just kind of under kind of like house restrictions. But the Japanese, they had it really bad, and they were interned. It was mostly like a transfer station where they would be here for a few days or a few weeks, and then they would be transported to Montana, Arizona, or wherever the camps were. And today, this is an archery range run by the San Francisco, I think it's called the San Francisco Archers. And they have been running this archery range in that area for a long time. Are you taping me? You're taping me?
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people know Pacifica for one thing.
Okay.
What do you think it is?
The weather?
The weather. Well, the beach, right? And,
Oh, yeah.
and surfing. So some of the original surfers of California came from Lindemar. Lindemar Beach is a really great beach to start at. So a lot of beginners start at Lindemar Beach. So there's a big history of surfing at Lindemar Beach, especially at Pedro Point. Like I said, the train station now is a surfer's house. If you go there, you'll see there's tons of boards and things. Here's some of the pictures of Dick Keating, who was a surfer way back in 1944, I think, and one of his original boards. Some of the boards were just huge. And what's striking today is that they did not wear wetsuits. And it's very cold out there, and I'm not sure when wetsuits were. I think it was O'Neill in Santa Cruz who developed the wetsuit.
Oh, ooh. I like how they went surfing back then.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
And they were pretty brave. This is Dick Keating out here. This is 1940s surfing at Cedar Point. And
I like
that
their
shows-
surfboards I like how they have their surfboards back in the day.
Yeah.
How they
Well,
made them.
look at the picture on the left.
Yeah.
Those are huge.
Right?
Really huge.
I like their swimsuits.
Yeah.
There's
Those
some-
old-fashioned swimsuits.
Yeah.
Kind of cool. Yeah.
And we got stuff in the back too.
Not really that interesting. There's not a whole lot back there. We just have some really nice photos of the surfers.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is this an old surfboard or is it how long ago?
That's a good question. I don't know how old that surfboard is.
Oh.
It doesn't look that long though.
I know, right? Compared
Yeah,
to
we should have a description of it. I don't know about that
Cool.
surfboard.
I mean, it's a good decoration.
Yeah. This exhibit. Oh, here it is. This is the thing that goes downstairs. Okay. I don't know that much about this exhibit, but this is about the development of Devil's Slide.
Oh wow.
And for many years, Devil's Slide, of course, when there were heavy rains, would literally slide into the ocean.
And people would go. A lot of people have gone over.
Yeah. Well, I grew up nearby, and there were helicopters. We would hear helicopters, and my dad would say, "Oh no, somebody went over." So, for a long time, they wanted to do something, and so the Caltrans came up with this idea of building like a 4-lane road that would kind of chop off the top of the mountain.
Oh, okay.
And so a lot of people got very upset about the prospect of this big, almost like a freeway that would cut across Devil's Slide. So I think it was the Sierra Club and a lot of environmental groups, they proposed a tunnel. And at first Caltrans was like, I don't know. And after many years, and there was even a lawsuit that Sierra Club brought, they decided to go for a tunnel, which is what's used in Europe a lot, is tunnels, you know,
Yeah.
which kind of saves the landscape.
I like how the tunnel's built too, with the fans and how they
Isn't
made
it
it. That's pretty
cool?
nice. I like it.
I think they're beautiful, those
Yeah.
tunnels.
Yeah.
And so it saved that mountain, because originally
Look at these
they were gonna shave like part of the mountain off, and, you know, and now, you know, the old highway is
Yeah.
a hiking and biking.
It's just, I wish they like put like a little like well, since I know some computer, like a repeater or like a little device in the tunnels, because you always lose reception and stuff in it.
Yeah, oh, maybe something can be done.
That'd be cool.
I think sometimes in tunnels they can do something about reception.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've been open, what, about 10 years now? I can't remember the year they opened, and they're the Tom Lantos, I think, the former congressman. 2013 was the opening of the tunnels. The Tom Lantos tunnels at Devil's Slide.
I like that
Wait,
shape.
I've always,
That's cool. Yeah, that was a big deal.
my family always came to Pacifica. We always go to Rockaway Beach or something. So
To Nick's
Nick's
restaurant?
we usually go to either we just usually climb Rockaway Beach.
You climb it?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Like we walk on it, and then I actually climb up the the front of it. There's a little
Oh.
path you have to walk
Yeah.
up. It's kind of steep.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Is that
So-
like Maury Point? Because he had an Italian worker, who made this cheese that was based on kind of an Italian
Yeah.
recipe. And then that guy went to work in Monterey at a different farm. So we were calling it Pacifica Jack now. And you can buy it here in our gift shop. Been along the coast, and they had seen Monterey Bay, and they thought Monterey Bay was a great natural harbor. And so they wanted him to come and explore the inland and come up by land. So he was the first one to do that. Well, he missed Monterey Bay when they were coming up, and he kind of landed along the San Mateo County coast. And his first campground in this area was in Lindemar, today Lindemar, where the Sanchez.
Portola. Yeah.
Yeah, the Sanchez Adobe
Right.
is, and there were the Ohlone were here, the Ohlone tribe, and the Spaniards were kind of starving, and they weren't doing so well. The Ohlone gave them food, kind of helped them out a little bit. And the next morning, when they camped, Portola sent his men up to the ridge. And what's up there on that ridge? It's Sweeney Ridge.
It's in Millbrae.
Yeah,
It's
Never
underneath 280.
yeah.
Oh yeah.
So today there's a monument up there. It's where they went up.
Yeah.
And that's the first time that Europeans ever saw San Francisco.
We've
Bay.
been there, Dad, up to the top there underneath the Portola Expedition Camp. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they got up there, they saw that there were Ohlone camps all along the, and they didn't know what it was. They didn't know if it was a river or a big lake or whatever. So today we don't really call it the discovery of the bay, because obviously there were people already here who knew about it. But it was the first time Europeans had seen San Francisco Bay from there. And now it's part of GGNRA today. All kind of San Francisco at one point. So he got it, the entire thing as a Mexican land grant. Well, when he died, his widow kind of split it up. They had a lot of children. I can't remember how many.
Something like 9 o'clock.
Something like 13 kids. And so the kids got some of it, and then they ended up selling parts of it. The biggest landholder at one point became the Tobin family. The Tobins owned Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. They were Irish immigrants. Very well. Tobins ended up owning almost what is today Lindemar, which was called Pedro Valley back then. And they started leasing the land out to farmers. And originally they were Irish, Scottish, and Daly City and Colma were planted in cabbage. And they were famous. Daly City and Colma was famous for cabbages, and they were shipped back east in these rail cars to Chicago and New York and everything. And part of this area too was all cabbages, potatoes, oat, barley. But the potatoes and the oats and the barley didn't do very well. And there was a Scottish family in this area, Sharp Park, we think maybe Pedro Valley, that had potatoes. And there was a blight in the 1860s. And just about that time, this Italian guy named Silicani married into the Scottish family that had the land down here. And he planted this thing called... So the history of Pedro Valley goes way back. It goes back to, of course, the Ohlone Indians who were here, and then when Portola came. This exhibit is mostly about the time after Francisco Sanchez's death, which was in the 1860s, and the start of the farming period, which lasted about 100 years. So after Francisco Sanchez died, his widow inherited the land. She ended up selling it off to the Tobin family. The Tobin family were very wealthy bankers in San Francisco. The Tobins were Irish immigrants who came to San Francisco during the gold rush. And they ended up leasing the land to a lot of different farmers. Mostly it was Irish at the beginning. In 1958, so here you see the entire valley in artichoke farms. And there was probably a dozen or so farmers, and the farms were strips that came across. They were north to south across the valley. And in 1958, what we would call the front of the valley was developed. The back, which was Park Pacifica, was not yet developed in 58. That came a little bit later. It's owned most of what is today Pedro Valley and Lindemar. They were a wealthy family. They had their one of their summer estates was in today's Lindemar. It was called the homestead, the Tobin homestead. The Irish and the Chinese came in the 1860s, 1870s. One of the families that came was a Scottish family named the Inches. They grew potatoes, and they grew barley, and they grew cabbages. And the potatoes and the barley didn't do so well. One of the Inches' daughters married an Italian man named Silicani, who came in the 1860s, and we think it was Silicani who planted the first artichoke in, perhaps on the entire San Mateo County coast. Mr. Silicani married into the Inches family, and their farm was actually in this area, Sharp Park, Fairway Park, in today's Pacifica. We think they had some land in Pedro Valley as well. So by 1880, a lot more Italians came in, and the artichoke farms started spreading. And the artichokes started doing really well because the artichokes grow very well in this climate. The Italians figured out a way to get the artichokes to blossom twice a year. I mean, they're usually a spring vegetable. They got them so that they came up in the fall as well. So it was became a very profitable crop, especially if they could get them to the East Coast, where there were a lot of Mediterranean, Greek, and French people who ate artichokes. They used the Ocean Shore Railroad, which started in 1905, and the artichoke farmers were able to get them to the East Coast by rail at that point. Right around that time, the first Italian families came in, and they were leasing land from the Tobins. Some of them started buying land and started actually doing pretty well as artichoke farmers themselves. The Pedro Valley during that time, the name was actually changed to Tobin. The early developers of the train thought they could sell pieces of land around the railroad stations as summer homes. Kind of funny to think of summer homes in Pacifica, but that was their idea, that they could have summer home developments in this area. In 1908, the first cars of the artichokes were sent to New York. They realized, though, that a lot of Americans didn't know how to eat artichokes. They formed an artichoke growers association in Half Moon Bay, and in every crate of artichokes they put a brochure that described 33 different ways of cooking the artichokes, because they're a very difficult vegetable to prepare, to eat, and so they felt like they really needed to show the average American how to eat artichokes. And this is where the Michelucci family comes in. And Julia, who was born in 1912 in Pedro Valley by a midwife, was part of this big Michelucci family that had been here from the turn of the century, I think. They had come from the Lucca area of Italy, where a lot of the Italians came from, that came to San Francisco during the gold rush. They came from Lucca and Genova. So we've got some really great photos from that era, basically because of Julia's work and her memoir that she wrote, which is probably the only thing we have that gives us an idea of what life on the farms was like. We have some pictures of the Michelucci's. We think this is where Shamrock Ranch is now. Some of the families lived on Shamrock Ranch. In the 1930s, Julia's cousins, the Rovais, lived in Pedro Valley. This is my family, this is my father, this is my uncle. They came in the 1930s. They had an artichoke farm there. Can I get you some iced tea? Yeah. One of the landmarks of early Pacifica was on Pedro Point. This was a place everybody knew. This kind of sprung up when the railroad came in, and it was Mr. Danman, who I think was a German, and he built a hotel and a bar that burned down in the 1960s. So life on the farms was pretty hard work. The artichoke farmers got up really early. These are some pictures we have. These pictures we think are from the Colma, Daly City area, and it shows how the farmers transported their, this is cabbage here, and they use these big trucks to get to the San Francisco produce market. They worked using horses. They worked in big family groups. A lot of families had brought other family members from Italy to help them out. A lot of them ended up going back to Italy. They only stayed for a few years. A lot of the men were bachelors, and they ended up going home after a while. During the Prohibition era, there was a lot of activity on the coast. There was a lot of bootlegging. There were speakeasies, the Sanchez Adobe, the old Tobin estate became a speakeasy. There were Canadian ships that were docked offshore, and they unloaded their whiskey at little secret landing spots. A lot of the Italians got involved. There are stories that some of the whiskey and the Canadian whiskey was put underneath the vegetables as they were brought into San Francisco. Meanwhile, a lot of people from San Francisco were coming down the coast to drink in the illicit places that were there. After World War II, the area started becoming very, very densely populated, especially starting in Daly City, where Henry Dolger started building homes. The returning GIs stayed. They didn't want to go back to the Midwest. They didn't want to go back to the South, perhaps. They wanted to stay in California, so there was a real housing crisis, and the developers started building along the coast. One was Andy Odstad, and he had worked for Dolger, and his uncles had developed the Stonestown Shopping Center. And Odstad thought that Pedro Valley was just a prime piece of real estate and really ideally situated for these booming. It was the baby boom generation. They were all having kids, and they needed houses and places to live. He started using a local real estate agent, Ray Higgins. He started approaching the Italian farmers who at that point had purchased their land after many years of leasing it. And Ray Higgins, working on behalf of Andy Odstad, approached the Italians, and in one weekend there were 7 families decided to sell, and they sold to Higgins, and the development of Lindemar began. And when it started, it happened very quickly, and within a year or so there were hundreds of families moving to Lindemar. And the Lindemar Rancher, a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house that sold for about $10,000, they started going up. At first there weren't the roads were dirt, there were no telephones, there were no markets, there were no schools. The first school children went to school in some of the unfinished houses that Odstad had built. And so it was such a such a monumental occasion that Time and Life magazine came to what was then known as Lindemar, and it was featured in Time and Life magazine about this phenomena of these hundreds of school kids going to school in these unfinished schoolhouses. In 1957, the people who had moved to Lindemar were instrumental in getting the city of Pacifica to incorporate as a city. They wanted the services of a police department, Parks and Rec, which they at that point did not have. It was not a real city. And in November of 1957, finally, after a couple of failed attempts at the ballot box, the city of Pacifica was born. And Pedro Valley at that point was no more.